Today's Bumblebee exclusive is going to dive into 10 mind-breaking punishments from medieval history. Contemporary commenters and law codes seem to settle on two particular modes of medieval punishment as the worst. The first being hanging and drawing. So this punishment is where brutality and finesse used merited the higher compensation for the gaoler. The condemned person would be strangled just enough to still be conscious, but not enough to be fully present. Then they'd be propped up just enough so that they can be forced to witness and feel their own slow disembowelment, with each organ being pulled from their body and held aloft so that they and the spectators may all see. At the sentencing judge's discretion, the condemned may also have their limbs chopped off and then have to watch various body parts be burnt in the fire alongside their organs. That or they experience the mercy of being beheaded before their body was chopped into pieces to finish off the spectacle. And the second worst mode decided is the breaking wheel. So, in 1302, Simon Hanenbart was broken on the wheel before being hung, drawn, and quartered. Suffice to say, some of history's worst punishments were often doubled up on top of each other. I mean, Simon even got the quartering part, which is where they use the 4 horses tied to your limbs to tear you apart. Anyways, to break someone on the wheel, the gaoler would tie the person down on a wagon wheel, spread-eagled, and then spin it, Lazy Susan style. As the person spun around with a heavy object like a mallet, dull axe, or a post, that gaoler would smash the person's limbs in the spaces between the spokes, so that way the limbs would snap and become mincemeat with every hit. In a variation, the condemned person might be staked to the ground with blocks placed under their limbs to simulate the spokes of a wheel. The gaoler would start from the feet and gradually work their way up, bone snapping hit by bone snapping excruciating hit. Sometimes there might be a finishing blow, but other times the wheel would just be hoisted onto a pole and the person would be left to die. These two first modes of death were, all agreed by everyone in medieval time, the worst handed down by the law. This next story was borrowed and altered slightly, but its origin remains locked in the tower. So, in Canto 33 of Inferno, Dante and Virgil happen across 2 sinners buried together in the same hole, just their heads sticking out. One of them is Uglinio della Girardesca and is eternally gnawing and consuming the head of the other dude. The story of Uglinio's prophetic dream and his heart-rendering report of his children's suffering are Dante's inventions, but the origin of that story is not. After falling out of favor with the citizens of Pisa in 1288, Uglino and his family members were arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of Muda. After a year of imprisonment, one day in 1289, rather than send up soldiers with food like normal, the archbishop ordered the tower sealed and the abandoned family was left to slowly realize their grim fate. This is a form of immurement, which we'll talk about later, and it was often done to and by nobility to one another, locking their cheating daughters into dungeons like Tordenel's affair, or putting them up there to prevent them usurping you like the Ottoman sultans, many of whom, like Mustafa's, mind broke while isolated in cells. But for those who crave to be amongst their lords, they could find themselves wearing the hot crown if they weren't careful. A monk named Pintoyen from southern France, 1384, described the demise of John Patrick, who wasn't even involved in the revolt or the fighting against the revolt. He was just an ambassador from Scotland to Aragon and just passing through France on his way. But the rebels took him for an example of the royal taxing authority, and instead they seized the man to give him a punishment reserved for men who usually hung on the coattails of leaders everyone reviled rather than rebel with them as well. They forced a red-hot iron crown on his head. This punishment was enacted on many power-hungry men or your odd John Patrick type who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another example is Gregory d'Orsa, who led a crusade/rebellion that ultimately failed, and the peasant king was tied onto an iron throne that was very slowly heated by coals underneath. A red-hot iron crown was then forced on his head and a burning scepter shoved in his hands. D'Orsa endured this for over an hour before he passed, which I imagine would have stung, but not so much as the next thing will. Impaling. It's up next. So, impalement stands out as arguably the slowest and most painful form of torment yet, designed to avoid vital organs so as to prolong the victim's life and suffering. Impalement was also a psychological weapon, this public spectacle designed to sow terror in the hearts of onlookers and serve as a severe warning to anyone who might defy the ruling power. But also, victims would be forced to watch in line as the stake was prepared, other victims impaled before them. or they'd even have the impending ordeal explained to them in graphic detail, instilling immense fear before the physical torment even begins. And once you were impaled, the suffering didn't even finish fast. The stake is hoisted up vertically, serving as a gruesome display stand. Lubricated with oil or grease, the stake would slowly slide through the victim as their body was pulled by gravity downward, the base of it widening and widening and thus stretching and tearing them further and further. The stake's progress was agonizingly slow and could take hours or even days to result in death. Next segment is how accountability wasn't just on a killer, it's the annoyance fee. A bit of a break from doom and gloom to instead focus on something that's downright ridiculous, which is that in the event of a death in medieval Britain, you know, someone giving somebody else the stabby, the community it occurred in is fined for breaking the king's peace. Even if it's like a 200-person village that's 80 kilometers away from the king, they still broke his peace even though he didn't find out about it until like 2 weeks after the death, but whatever. So the value of the fine is determined by the value of the life-ending weapon. This practice was continued until the mid-1800s, and it was only stopped when a man was run over by a train and the town was fined the value of the train by the king. Clearly, they rose enough of a fuss for this archaic issue to get put to bed. So if someone was killed with this next method, I guess they'd be fined like, what, 10 cents? Because it's rat torment. Using animals for death sentences has been popular since pre-medieval times, when Romans and Greeks would set wild cats on convicts in their amphitheaters, or women would be violated to death by donkeys or giraffes for adulterous crimes. And in India, you could see elephants trained to toy with their victims before stomping them to death. But as we know, medieval Europeans were damn savages. No wonder they invented rat torment, as seen in, yes, the sinister horror franchise and Game of Thrones. So the most common was to start with the restrained victim, have him tied to a chair or to the ground. The rat is set atop the body, usually on the abdomen, and covered with a container like a metal bucket. Then heat is applied to the top end of said bucket, and the rat inside would start to panic. Conveniently, the human abdomen is very soft and fleshy, so when the rat desperately starts clawing for a way out, the only way was to dig through the body. The rat would dig and slowly burrow into the person until their death, usually from shock. While that method kept the weapon in the box, this next one, the victim is immurement. So, in 1409, 4 Bavarian clerics in Augsburg, Germany, were immured in a particularly macabre manner. Having taken the innocence of multiple youths, the Church of Augsburg sealed the clerics inside of wooden coffins before suspending the coffins inside a tower and leaving them to starve to death in the midair. Depending on your particular phobias, immurement might be the most horrifying medieval death of all time, as it meant being sealed into a wall, a box, a pillar, a floor, whatever, until, well, death or freedom. It depends on the sentence and how much people liked you. While some cases of immurement were just temporary punishments, those who were sentenced to die this way were forced to confront the fact that their only freedom was death, that they would have no contact with the outside world as they experienced days, weeks, or even months in isolation until their final breath. This second to last segment will have you fearing the flames, so the use of fire to cook people alive has been found in multiple medieval stories. Naturally, the most famous example is the death via burning at the stake, where your death isn't actually even from smoke inhalation or skin melting or even shock. Your death when you burn alive actually comes from suffocating on your own organs burning. The gridiron was basically a grill built by Hannibal Lecter. As one might suspect, it looks like a giant iron grid placed over fire or burning coals. Pretty basic stuff. And some people even get basted in oil first to ensure proper broiling before they get cooked. Another famous fire metal combo is the Spanish boot, putting people in metal shoes that you then put over flames. But I mean, anytime you hear anything about any torment device from medieval times, prongs, tongs, scrapers, and pickers, all of these are heated before their use because medieval tormentors really loved their flames and they love their hot metal. At the last point on our list, you may have noticed that medieval people really lean towards death as a punishment for just about anything, really anything. So let's answer the age-old question, which is why death? Food and labor. Think about it, guys. Food was, well, it wasn't scarce unless there was a bad harvest, which was twice to 5 times per decade, with an outright famine usually once per century, maybe twice. But food was not abundant, and then almost the entire population in medieval times was directly involved in food production, as farmers, orchard workers, fishermen, hunters, and trappers. Only a tiny leftover fraction could do other things, and most of those did other forms of labor. So, layman terms, if you take a man and you put his ass in jail, he can't work, but he still eats. You punish a man by preventing him from working, but then someone else has to work to feed this man who's being punished. That doesn't make sense in a medieval economy where the basic economic unit is not coin, it's staple food, it's grain. So imprisonment was, as forementioned, just for nobles who were locked into like a tower or cell, and their family would have to pay for their food on some occasions. For commoners, town citizens, it was actually only ever used as a storage until a trial before a judge, and then in between again until the punishment was carried out. And that punishment was death. Because if you aren't going to eat to work or work to eat, you shouldn't live at all. And that's the end of another Bumblebee exclusive. I sure hope you enjoyed. Take time to like, share, and of course, comment down below.